You're nothing next to my mother-in-law. My son looked me dead in the eye, sitting at my own kitchen table, eating food I cooked, and told me I was nothing compared to his mother-in-law. Nothing. After 31 years of raising him alone, after every payment I made on the roof over his head, he said her name like it was gold and mine like it was garbage. So I smiled, poured him another cup of coffee, and 3 days later I called the bank and stopped every single house payment I'd been quietly making for him. He didn't see it coming. Not even close. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to know something. Type in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. I love seeing all the different cities and countries pop up. It makes this feel like we're all sitting around the same table. And if you believe a mother's love has limits, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story has a lot of turns in it, and you won't want to miss where it ends up. My name is Brenda. I'm 73 years old. I've lived in this same small town my whole life, in a house my late husband and I built plank by plank when we were younger than my grandchildren are now. I raised one son, just one, after my husband passed when the boy was only 14. I worked 2 jobs. I cleaned houses in the morning and did the books for a hardware store in the afternoon. I never remarried, never even dated much, because every spare hour I had went into making sure that boy had shoes that fit and a lunch that wasn't just a sleeve of crackers. I tell you all this not to brag. Any mother would have done the same. I tell you this because it matters for what comes later, because when a woman gives everything she has to raise a child, and that child grows up and hands her nothing but insults, something inside her doesn't just bend. It breaks. And when it breaks, it doesn't always break quietly. My son grew up, got married to a lovely girl, and for the first few years things were good. I loved my daughter-in-law. I still do, honestly. She's caught in the middle of all this the same as I am. But it was her mother, the woman I'll simply call the mother-in-law in this story, who became the center of my son's universe the moment those wedding bells rang. And I don't mean he loved her the way you love family. I mean he began to measure me against her out loud in front of people like I was a contestant losing a contest I never signed up for. It started small. She'd host a Sunday dinner and he'd rave about her cooking for a week, forgetting I'd cooked that same brisket recipe for him since he was 6 years old. She'd give him a birthday card with $200 tucked inside, and he'd tell me, see, that's what real generosity looks like, even though I had spent 30 years buying his school clothes, his car insurance, his first apartment security deposit. It wasn't about the money. It was about being erased. 3 years ago, my son and his wife bought a house. A real house, a starter home with a little yard and a crooked mailbox that needed fixing. They didn't have the down payment, so I gave it to them. Every dollar of my retirement cushion, the money I had set aside so I wouldn't be a burden on anyone in my old age, I handed over without blinking, because that's what you do for your child. And it didn't stop there. When the mortgage got tight, when his hours got cut at work, I quietly started making the monthly house payment myself, wiring it straight to the mortgage company so he wouldn't even have to ask me for it. I never told him exactly how much I was covering. I never wanted him to feel like a charity case. I just wanted my son to have a roof that didn't leak and a life that didn't wobble. For 2 years, I paid a chunk of that mortgage every single month. Quietly. Faithfully. Like a woman keeping a promise to herself as much as to him. And here's a small thing I want you to notice because it matters later. I never once threw it in his face. I never said, remember who paid for that roof. I just did it the way you water a plant, expecting nothing back but growth. Now back to that Tuesday evening at my kitchen table. My son had come over like he did most weeks, and this time his tone had an edge to it I didn't recognize at first. He was talking about the holidays, about where we'd all go for the big family dinner, and I made an offhand comment about hosting it at my place like I always had. And that's when he said it. He set his fork down, looked at me and said, honestly, you're nothing next to her mother. She actually knows how to bring a family together. You just sort of exist. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second the way I had to sit with it. You just sort of exist. 31 years of sacrifice boiled down to existing. I didn't cry in front of him. I've never been a woman who cries in front of people who've hurt her. I save that for the shower alone, where no one can use my tears as proof that they've won. I just nodded, said something about it getting late, and sent him home. That night I sat at my kitchen table long after the dishes were done, staring at the mortgage statement I kept in a folder in my desk drawer. I thought about every payment. I thought about the years I skipped new shoes for myself so his kids could have Christmas presents. I thought about the word nothing, and I made a decision that felt less like anger and more like clarity. If I was nothing to him, then my money, earned from decades of scrubbing other people's floors and balancing other people's books, was nothing to him either. It shouldn't be his to lean on anymore. If you've ever had a moment like that, a moment where the fog clears and you finally see the shape of what's actually happening to you, I want you to type clarity in the comments below. And go ahead and hit that subscribe button now if you haven't, because what I did next surprised even me, and I promise you it gets better from here. The next morning, I called the mortgage company. I told them I wanted to stop the automatic transfer I had set up 2 years earlier. The one that quietly padded my son's monthly payment so he'd never come up short. The representative asked if everything was all right. I told her everything was perfectly fine, that I simply needed my money for myself now, and she processed it without another question. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes to undo something I had done faithfully month after month, for over 700 days. Then I called my bank and moved the rest of what I'd been setting aside for him, the just-in-case cushion I kept for whenever his hours got cut again, into a separate account with my name and only my name on it. I didn't drain anything that was legally his. I simply stopped feeding a fire that had never once warmed me back. I want to be honest with you about something. I didn't do this out of spite alone. Spite fades. What I felt was more like self-respect finally waking up after a long nap. I had spent so many years defining myself by what I could give my son that I forgot I was allowed to keep something for myself, especially after being told I was nothing. About 3 weeks later, I got the phone call. My son, sounding rattled in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager who'd wrecked his first car, told me the mortgage company had sent a letter. Apparently the payment had come up short. Not by a small amount either. Short enough that the late fee alone made his voice crack a little. He asked me almost casually like it was nothing if I could help cover it this month, just this once. I said no. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked why, genuinely confused, like the wire transfers had simply always existed in the universe, like rain or sunlight, with no woman behind them making sacrifices. I told him calmly that I had decided to focus on my own retirement and my own future, since apparently my presence in the family didn't amount to much anyway. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't bring up the exact words he'd used at my kitchen table. I let the silence between us do that work for me. If you're the kind of person who believes silence can be the loudest response of all, drop a little comment below telling me what state or country you're watching from. I really do read every single one, and it means the world to an old woman who spends her evenings alone at this same kitchen table. Here is where the story takes its first real turn. See, what my son didn't know was that his mother-in-law, the woman he compared me to so unfavorably, had her own financial troubles brewing that he knew nothing about. She had co-signed a business loan for a relative of hers that had gone sideways, and word around town, because in a small town word always gets around, was that she was quietly asking family members for help covering her own bills. The very woman held up as the gold standard of generosity was, in fact, leaning on people the same way I had been leaning in to support my son, except she wasn't hiding it nearly as gracefully. She'd mention it at church. She'd mention it at the grocery store. My son just hadn't put the pieces together yet, because when you're busy comparing your own mother to a shining fantasy version of somebody else, you don't ask too many questions about the reality underneath the shine. When my son's mortgage payment came up short a second month in a row, and the late fees started stacking, he finally worked up the nerve to ask his wife's family for help instead of me. That's when he found out the truth. The mother-in-law he'd praised endlessly at my expense didn't have $200 spare to rub together, let alone the kind of steady financial cushion I'd been providing without a single complaint for 2 years straight. She apologized to him, told him things were tight, and for the first time in a long while my son had absolutely nowhere to turn. He came back to my house. I could see it in his face before he even said a word. That particular look people get when the story they've been telling themselves about their life doesn't match reality anymore. He sat down at the same kitchen table in the same chair, and this time there was no comparison to anyone. There was just him asking his mother for help, the way it probably should have been all along, except this time I wasn't rushing to say yes. I asked him one simple question. I asked him to repeat, out loud, what he'd said to me a month earlier about being nothing next to somebody else's mother. He got quiet. He mumbled that he didn't remember saying it quite like that. I reminded him word for word. because a woman doesn't forget the exact sentence that made her feel erased in her own kitchen. He apologized. It was a real apology, I'll give him that, not the kind people mumble just to get what they want. His voice cracked in a way that told me some part of him actually understood what he'd done. But here's the thing about respect, and I want anyone watching this to really hear me on this point. Respect that only shows up after the money runs out isn't really respect. It's convenience wearing respect's clothing. So I told him something I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks. I told him I loved him, that I would always love him, because that particular kind of love doesn't have an off switch no matter how badly it's treated. But I told him that loving him and financing him were two very different things, and from now on they were going to stay separated. I didn't refuse to help entirely. I'm not a woman who enjoys watching her son lose his house out of pure principle. That's not the story I wanted, and it's not who I am. Instead, I sat down with him and we worked out an actual plan on paper with real numbers. I agreed to help him catch up on the missed payments, but as a loan documented with a schedule for him to pay me back a little each month, the same way he'd pay back any bank. No more invisible wire transfers disguised as maternal magic. If he wanted my support, it would come with structure, with respect, and with the basic decency of never being compared to anyone else's mother again. He agreed. He didn't love it, I could tell, because some small part of him had gotten used to the money simply appearing like weather. But he agreed, and slowly, month by month, he started paying it back. Not just the money either. He started calling more, checking in without needing anything, showing up for actual Sunday dinners at my table instead of only praising someone else's brisket from a distance. If you've ever had to teach someone, even someone you love fiercely, that love and enabling are not the same thing, I want you to type boundaries in the comments, because that's exactly the lesson this whole ordeal taught me at 73 years old, when I honestly thought I was too old to learn anything new about myself. The mother-in-law and I never had a confrontation. If you're waiting for that kind of dramatic showdown, that's not really how life works when you're my age. Instead, something quieter happened. At the next big family gathering, my son stood up to say a few words before we ate, and instead of comparing anyone to anyone, he simply thanked me. He said his mother had taught him more about real strength in the last few months than he'd learned in his whole life, and he said it looking right at me, not at anyone else's mother, not measuring me against a shine that had turned out to be a fantasy in the first place. I won't pretend it fixed everything overnight. Trust, once cracked, takes a long time to set back the way it was, and honestly, I'm not sure it ever fully returns to its original shape. I think it just grows a different, sturdier shape instead. But I'll tell you this. I sleep better now than I have in years. Not because I punished my son, because that was never really my goal, but because I finally remembered that a woman who gives everything away, quietly, invisibly, without ever asking to be seen, eventually teaches the people around her that she doesn't need to be seen at all. I wasn't willing to teach that lesson anymore. These days, my son still calls me every Sunday. Sometimes he brings his wife, and sometimes, believe it or not, even the mother-in-law joins us for dinner, and we've actually become something like friends, two older women who've both learned the hard way that being generous doesn't mean being invisible. We laugh about it sometimes. In that particular way, only women our age can laugh about the things that once nearly broke us. If this story meant something to you, if any piece of it reminded you of your own kitchen table, your own quiet sacrifices, or your own moment of finally saying no, I want you to like this video and subscribe for more stories just like it, because there are so many more where this one came from. And before you go, tell me one more time in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight, because knowing how far these stories travel, how many different homes and kitchen tables they land in, is honestly one of the great joys left in this chapter of my life. I'm Brenda. I'm 73 years old, and I finally learned, later than I would have liked but exactly when I needed to, that being someone's mother was never supposed to mean being no one at all.